Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm April Woodard, and I just want to ask the question, will a dozen of weeks of protesting lead to more convictions of bad cops and police reform? Well, today we will get perspectives from New York defense attorney Paul Martin and diversity advocate and chairman of Beveridge and Diamond firm Benjamin Wilson Esquire. We're also going to hear from the New York Times journalist who was actually with Dr. King when he was assassinated. He also was the man who covered racial unrest in the 60s, Earl Caldwell. This is Conversations in Chaos, Law and Disorder. Thanks so much for joining me on Facebook and YouTube and also other platforms. I want to tell you about my first guest. He is a criminal defense attorney and a former prosecutor, and you can catch his bold expertise on CNN and HLN. Take a look.
Individuals who just do not want to accept that there are racist and racial components to these cases. And the fact of the matter is that a police officer would not have approached this gentleman and this young lady if they would have been of a different hue. If they were white, this situation would have never occurred. And so don't tell me that race does not take a place in this case.
All right, telling it like it is Paul Martin. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I first got to ask you, and what you've seen over the past weeks, are you optimistic about change?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm looking forward. I think we have to have a bigger picture than just police reform. I think this is a unique opportunity we have in our country. We have an opportunity to look at our educational system, look at the actual criminal justice system, not just the police interaction with people of color. Look at economic disparity. I think there's a lot of avenues which we could really touch upon during these times.
All right. Thank you, Paul. I want to invite our next guest. He's my colleague at Hampton University, and in the 60s he covered racial unrest for the New York Times and a part of the landmark case, the United States versus Caldwell, for refusing to give up his notes on the Black Panthers to the FBI. He also was the only reporter, back then they didn't call it embedded, but he was embedded with Dr. King, and he was there the day he was assassinated. Here's a clip.
But the explosion when it was the bullet that killed King, it was so great. I thought someone had bombed the motel. If a police officer asked me where the shot came from, I never was able to even answer him. I was so sure that it was the police attacking.
All right, Earl Caldwell. Earl, welcome.
Nice to be here.
So, Earl, talk to me about the differences that you're seeing. You know, you were there during the 60s, during the height of the protests. So how can you compare to what's going on today?
There is no comparison. In the 60s, it was Black folks burning down their own neighborhoods. Police, National Guards were shooting them. Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Watts, there'd be 30, 40 people killed. It was just totally different. It was a rage, but really the rage against even their neighborhoods, the houses they lived in, the police, it was everything. And the next 40 years, they were still in the neighborhoods that were never rebuilt. Now they're being rebuilt for some new people that are coming in.
Yeah,
no
sure.
I don't see any comparison.
Okay. All right. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I want to bring in our next guest, and he is someone I'm super proud of, and he literally is my older brother. He grew up in the 60s during the tumultuous times in Jackson, Mississippi, and that's when he became inspired to fight for justice himself.
I remember seeing Constance Baker Motley escort James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. I thought she must be a physical giant, and she had the courage to do what men would not do. My heroes were the Freedom Riders, white and black students who got on a bus in Washington, D.C., and not knowing if they would come back from that trip. Who can forget those 4 young men from North Carolina A&T State University who sat in at the lunch counter at Greensboro?
Brother Ben, thank you for joining me.
April, good to be here. Thank you.
Sure. So we're talking about the Freedom Riders and seeing African Americans and whites together. You're seeing some of that now. You're seeing quite a mixture of people who are out protesting. What do you think about that?
Well, what I think is I'm pleased to see that there are people, whites, who do see this issue of race as their problem. And it is their problem. It is one they have made, and one that they must be a part of the solution. And I am pleased to see that a new generation of people is willing to see a common cause. And I thought, listening in earlier, I thought Paul made a very good point that we are hoping that not only will we see change in terms of how police brutality cases are handled, but changes in the criminal justice system, changes in the disparate impact in the healthcare system, employment, housing changes, educational inequities that must be addressed. But if we can move the needle now, and it appears there's an energy to do that, it can make all the difference. The great fear that I have, and I'm sure Earl could comment on this based upon his vast experiences, we've seen this before.
Yeah.
Where America gets excited, gets interested, but they quickly tire. And the question is, will they still be in this fight? Will we still be in this fight tomorrow? Will we be just as dedicated when the attention dies down and the cameras go home? And I'd like to believe that we will. And I'd like to believe that we will.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it's a very difficult time, a very stressful time. There's a lot of really strong feelings going on. And then today it was announced that President Trump will have his campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Juneteenth. Now, a historian called it blasphemous. Earl, take us back. Tell us why this is such an offense to so many people, being in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the site of the racial massacre of 1921, and then also on Juneteenth.
Well, black people take so much criticism for not doing this, not doing that. Tulsa, Oklahoma shows what black people can do, did do, and how white America responded to it. Such a painful story.
It is a painful story. And we actually have a clip of what happened to that community. That was an African-American, very prosperous community. And then there was an incident that happened that triggered it. Let's take a look at that clip.
Hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street, armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood district. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
I think it's interesting that LeBron James is actually going to be doing a documentary on this. But, you know, sometimes you hear people say, you know, this isn't America. This isn't America to be fighting and to be protesting. But do you guys agree with that assertion? Anybody?
Well, I think that what is happening right now, I think it's the most exciting thing I've seen in my lifetime. The reason I say it, and what's so different, in the 60s, my time on the streets, it was all black. This is a coalition that I've only ever seen. This is the coalition that Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of, and he was trying to build in 1968. That's what cost him his life. I seen a bit of it come together in the election of Obama. I get that same vibe now. And there's another piece to it. You see the kids and the young people, they're black and white and so many colors. It's the rainbow that we talk about. And it's serious. And sometimes you can see it's dangerous, but I can also see joyfulness.
Mm.
There's a joyfulness to it. That's hope. That's the thing that can keep it alive. It can grow it. Wow. I'm very optimistic.
Paul, I want to ask you, there was a turning point and a tipping point for this. A lot of people look at the fact that, we were in social distancing and sheltering at home, and we're in the midst of a pandemic, and people are at home, and there's rates of unemployment, particularly in the Black community. This was a video tape of George Floyd. And what do you think that had to do with the fact that the nation and the world really erupted?
Well, I think there's a number of factors that led to this whole reaction of Blacks and whites. I think we have Breonna Taylor, and then we had Mr. Aubrey that was just several weeks before this incident. And then, so this has been rumbling for a while. It's been the attitude of the person that occupies the White House and his treatment towards African Americans and his presentation as far as what took place in Virginia. And so I think as we've been going through this presidency during this period of time and seeing all the different ways in which African Americans have been disrespected, I think that this was just the fire stick that blew the whole thing open.
But April, we have seen this before.
Yeah.
In 1963, in May, when children were demonstrating in Birmingham, there were many in the South. The South said this did not really happen. It's an exaggeration, and the North could not believe it. But when Bull Connor turned those German Shepherd dogs and he turned the fire hoses on children, the mask was pulled off the ugly face of discrimination and racial hatred. That one incident changed history because people saw it on the nightly news.
Right.
What made George Floyd's murder different than that of the 1,200 other Black men and women who have died since 2015? I would submit to you that the whole world was watching. It could not avert its eyes. And I believe that has been a galvanizing point. The question remains, will this be sustained? And will the reforms that people are demanding, will we stick with it? And I choose to believe that we will.
All right, well, let's talk about those reforms a little bit. Let's talk about why it's so difficult for there to be a charge or a conviction of a police officer that obviously does something on camera. I mean, we've been talking about this since 1991 or before, when we all saw Rodney King get beat. So why are we not seeing these officers to be reprimanded, to be fired, to be charged, to be sent to jail? Why isn't that happening, Paul?
Well, I submit that there's a legal aspect and then there's the reality. The legal aspect is when juries are charged and they're told what the law is in these situations, the police are given what they call benefit of the doubt. Basically, they're told if their subjective intent is you believe what they were going through as they express it to you was reasonable, and they reacted in that manner in which was consistent with that reason, then they have a perfect defense in most of these cases. So all the officer has to say is not based upon what you think is reasonable, but I, at the time, had fear for my life. And therefore, I had to react in a manner which caused this person's death. So they have that subjective mindset that they have to consider, the jurors have to consider when looking at these cases. Now, here's the practical aspect. Most people want to believe that the police are good people. Most people want to believe that the police are behaving in a manner that is consistent with protecting their own lives and protecting their property. Therefore, they give them an extra benefit of a doubt. They prop them up. And so not only is it difficult to charge officers in these cases, to convict officers in these cases, but also when in situations where police officers are the only witnesses, most jurors give them the benefit of a doubt, even though to a criminal defense attorney or to people who have seen what happens on the streets, we know that the police are lying, but they don't get called out on it unless we do have the video.
Well, a word that's being thrown around a lot now is qualified immunity. Ben, can you go into what that is? I understand in 1967, qualified immunity was added to the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which was also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. But that word's being thrown around. Can anybody or Ben explain to me qualified immunity, what it is?
I would prefer to defer to Paul. I think his practice is such that his knowledge is superior to mine.
Well, I don't know about that, but basically what they're saying is you cannot sue a police officer for certain actions if they're performing their duties within the responsibilities or duties of a police officer. So if I'm acting as a police officer and I arrest somebody, and in the course of the arrest, I cause them physical injury, I have a certain amount of immunity in that you cannot sue me or I cannot be charged with a crime because I'm allowed to use reasonable force. So
I just wanted to say I have great deal respect for the men and women who do the police work in this country, but I do not believe there should be a different reasonable person standard because one wears blue and a badge. A reasonable man or reasonable woman should be the same wherever one lives and whatever occupation they have. And so the fact of the matter is this qualified immunity, as Paul has correctly defined it, has insulated police officers. I would also submit to you that prosecutors have discretion. Look at what happened in the Floyd case. Initially, the prosecutor stated they were going to bring a third-degree manslaughter claim.
Right.
A new prosecutor was named, and that charge went from third degree to second degree. Initially, the other police officers, now former officers, were not going to be charged. Now, with a new prosecutor, they are. So prosecutors have great discretion, and I think it's extremely important that communities demand that that discretion be exercised to protect the rights of innocent citizens, and all too often that has not happened when Black people are have a confrontation, sometimes not even a confrontation,
right,
with white police officers.
Yeah.
Can I just piggyback on that very quick, April? If you notice in the prosecution of defendant, I'm going to mispronounce his name. Is it Chavez?
Chauvin.
In the initial prosecution, the documents which were presented to the court, which provide the probable cause for the arrest, you can see the way the prosecutor lacked prosecutorial integrity in the way that the language in the document. In a normal situation, you would put forth just the bare minimum facts in order to get the case before a court, but you would not put in defenses for the defendant. In this situation, they added language from the autopsy talking about that he had certain drugs in his system. They added the language that Mr. Floyd had resisted. None of that was relevant to the probable cause for the arrest, but they were sending dog whistles to their constituency to let them know that there are issues with this case.
Right. And I want to bring Caldwell in real quick because, and I see we have a question for Ben, but I want to bring Caldwell in because, Earl, the time that you were covering these protests, there was no prosecution. There was no, accountability. Here's a picture of you on the left with Martin Luther King right before he was assassinated. People were dying and being killed and being lynched. There was no prosecution. So what is it like to hear actually somebody has been charged with something?
Well, yeah, I'm two my places here. I've just read an article in the LA Times. Since 2000,
a little bit.
Since
sorry, go ahead.
Since 2000, they've had 900 police killings, 80% of them black in the city, 25% of them blacks are less than 10% of the population of us.
My God.
Only 2 of these officers were charged. Only 2. And none of these cases, they all were homicides, and there was nothing done in any of them. So what I'm saying is that I believe we have to look more towards changing what policing is doing. We are now on this militarization of our police, not department, a police force. And it's this force now, it's not sprinkled equally. It's like the coronavirus. It's really tough on certain people. And that can only change with different people doing a different kind of police work. And that's my opinion.
Okay. All right. I want to ask Paul another question. Paul, you know, Breonna Taylor, it was supposed to be a stand your ground case, right? So Zimmerman had his stand your ground case. Why doesn't that defense work for us? They didn't know that they were coming through, and they were not in uniform, and he fired a shot. So why is that not clearly self-defense or stand your ground?
Well, the question becomes, why is there so little movement on the case so far?
Yeah.
How come we don't have the information that the body camera footage? Why don't we have the 911 calls? A lot of the information has been kept from the public, and the officers have been kept on administrative leave. I think the hope was that as time passed, they could sweep this under the rug as they've done other cases. And it's incumbent upon us, it's incumbent upon the media to keep this going. And so proper use of the law can be used for Black people just as it is for whites.
But I think there's one point to mention here. This was a no-knock warrant.
Yeah.
And they went to the wrong place.
Right.
And that's the great tragedy. And again, Paul has lived his life in handling these types of cases. But the fact of the matter is, the law is there to protect us as well. And so when you have something like a no-knock warrant, there's a greater likelihood that you could have these types of mistakes. This woman was a nurse. Yeah. She was helping people during the time of COVID, and she is gone, and no apology can ever bring her back. That's to me a great tragedy, and we should all be concerned, and we all are, about her situation and so many others.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a question, and it was one of my questions too. Gary says there's been a lot of discussion about defunding police departments. This seems to mean different things to different people. Can any of you comment on this? Who wants to take that one?
I'll leave it to the others. I don't know really what they mean by it.
Okay, well, we're all trying to find out. So
I'm not sure if defunding them is the right avenue. I do understand how we want to reallocate the resources that police officers are given in order to give them better training, which we've always said in the past. Provide a sensitivity training. We've said that in the past, but I've also like to see them change the way they conduct law enforcement. Mm-hmm. The reality is white people take drugs at a higher level just based upon numbers than Black people. It's just a fact of the matter. But the law enforcement of such is in our neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So reallocate that. If you treat all Black people want is to be treated as you do white people. All right. Don't come and ravage our neighborhoods and fill our jails with people that are Black and brown of color. And so I think there needs to be some reallocation of resources. I'm not so sure we are prepared for an immediate defunding, because who will police the streets if we do that? And that's the question.
anybody's reaction to Missouri deciding to dismantling the police?
Well, I don't see how you can dismantle the police. We are a violent country. We've got so many people with guns. You have to have a police force.
Mm-hmm.
The issue to me is that police force. You have to have better people, I believe, and you have to have, it has to be clear. Right now, the police, and I was very fascinated with Paul was explaining the law there. I just don't think police ought to be able to take that death penalty in their own hands. And you've got to, I think that means you have to change the people who are doing it.
Yes. Well, we have a question from Rachel to anybody who wants to answer it. What advice do you have for people of color who are wondering what they can do? Also, what can allies do during this time to support the Black community?
Well, I think there are many things. I think that first and foremost, I hope people will speak not only with family and friends and co-workers, and they're having those discussions. I hope that lawyers, for example, will actively seek to represent protesters that need assistance. Mm-hmm. I hope that we will all educate ourselves. And I think that's extremely important about how we got here. And I think that there's so many things that we can do, but having this dialogue and keeping it up. I think we have to be willing to have difficult conversations. I hope I can have a conversation with Paul and Earl, and if I say something that they don't like or offends them, they're going to give me the benefit of the doubt, and vice versa. And I think when you talk about a discussion of race between whites and blacks, unlike this panel here, that's a different type of challenge. I hope that we will lobby prosecutors to ensure that they're using their discretion in a way that counts for an even-handed application of the law. And finally, I think the most important word here, in my view, is accountability. The fact of the matter is, if you had a Black person killed by a Black person, and there's going to be accountability ultimately. At least we hope that the police will apprehend the person that's perpetrated this crime. But what happens here is there is not accountability in the police brutality context, that the person commits this violent crime but is not held accountable. And if people do not feel that the laws will be upheld, we will have disorder. And the fact of the matter is, we must have the rule of law to survive as a society, but there can be no rule of law unless it is applied fairly and equitably, irrespective of race or class. And that's all. That's the fundamental thing that we're talking about. Earl or Paul said it very well earlier. People just want to be treated fairly. When the day is done, treat me fairly.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, speaking of being treated fairly, I want to position this to Earl. You know, right now in the 60s, you said there wasn't a lot of comparisons to what's going on with the protests, but, you know, people were brutalized over trying to vote in the 60s. In 1965, there was Bloody Sunday. And now people are not being brutalized, but in Georgia, just as recently as a few days ago, people are standing in lines for 5 hours trying to vote. And there are allegations that you know, that it's voter suppression. So it's very, very similar, Earl. I'm interested in your take.
Well, I believe that I will say the Republicans who are in control now, they know that they cannot win an election if everybody has an equal opportunity to vote. If all of the eligible people in the country want to vote, they cannot win. That's just where this country has gone. And especially now when you have so much energy amongst the young people This election will probably be decided about, and it'll probably be contested because the forces in so many of the power centers are bound and determined that they're not going to let everybody vote.
Listen, I have to slightly disagree with my friend Earl. I do believe that much of what is happening today, we have seen before. Emmett Till whistles allegedly at a woman, right? And his body is mutilated. His mother insists on an open casket because she wants the world to know he could not have done this to himself. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a deacon in the church. Jimmy Lee Jackson is taken into custody by state troopers in Alabama, and he dies. And it's his death that prompts the Selma March that leads to Bloody Sunday. When I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, Medgar Evers, a brave and courageous man, killed late at night by an assassin. 30 years before the man who killed him was accountable, the 4 children, that same summer of 1963, the 4 little girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, that's bombed. It takes 30 years before the man who's responsible for this is held accountable. Those are the ones we know about. And so I wonder what might have happened but for the fact that the cameras exposed what happened with George Floyd. These men and women have mothers, they have fathers, they have siblings, they have children. Who knows what they might have contributed? So, no, this is in many ways history repeating itself. What may be different this time is that whites and blacks, there are even policemen who actually joined the marchers, the protesters in several instances. I don't remember that in the late 50s or 60s. So I do see a difference, and I hope we will keep talking to each other, because if we can talk to each other and address this issue of police brutality, then we can address criminal justice. And if we can address a criminal justice, then we can not only talk about disparate healthcare, but act on that. Because we know what the problem is, but we need action. We need it now.
Yeah, for sure. Some of the things that we are seeing, there is a federal bill that Cory Booker and Kamala Harris are sponsoring, or wrote the bill to give federal police reform bill. However, I think there's a caveat, because if they're not accepting federal money, then the bill doesn't necessarily apply to them. Anybody want to take that on?
I think it's stuck in the committee. I think it's stuck in Senate. I'm not sure if it's going to get passed through, because the Republican-controlled Senate does not like the terms or the language that has been put forth by Senator Booker. Let me say, I echo both of your guests' comments. I also say one of the things that we can do is vote. Vote and actually sit on these juries and actually take a part in this system. Not only we should vote, sit on juries, but also speak to our legislators about no longer having police officers not pay some of these verdicts. I think if we could sue them personally and take money out of their pockets, I think economics may change attitudes.
And I think reporting data too. A lot of these departments don't even have data on the behavior or people who have been reprimanded, people who have faced fines on the police force, or people who have lost their jobs and then gone to another county or another state and been hired as police officers there. So keeping the data is also a way to kind of keep an eye on what's going on. I want to turn for a minute too, because one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of people have gotten tired of waiting for these statues and the Confederate flag to not be hanging. And there was an incident that just happened last night in Portsmouth, Virginia. So I want to take a look at that clip. All right, so that was in Portsmouth, Virginia. They defaced it, and then they also beheaded each of the characters that were there, although they were generic. What do you think about people taking this into their own hands and just being tired of these monuments dedicated to Confederate generals?
Well, people are going to do that now. This is in the environment that we have now. They're going to do it. And I don't see anything wrong with it, really. I was talking with a friend this afternoon, early this afternoon, from Richmond. And he told me that he and his wife went over to take a picture over there and said that there was crowds there, maybe 50 or so people, was it about 50% white, 50% black. And he said that they seemed to be in a celebratory mood. But the only person that's really trying to, and I also noticed today that the NASCAR racing, the Confederate flag is their symbol. Take it down. They've said, no, you can't bring that here anymore. The only one that's standing in the door of this kind of change is the President of the United States. I believe that is the minority. The question is the minority going to be able to express itself, or are they going to be disenfranchised? And if they're disenfranchised, then we're not going to get to where we are trying to get to.
Listen, symbols matter. If you think about the military bases, Fort Hood in Texas, John Bell Hood, Fort Gordon, Fort A.P. Hill, Fort Polk, Leonidas Polk, all Confederate generals. There are 10 or 12 of those installations. Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And again, people choose to ignore the history.
Right.
These are men who took up arms against the United States, waged war for 4 years in the name and in defense of slavery.
Right.
Now, I can't explain what happened generations ago, but I know we don't live in that generation. Now, there are others, April, who would tell you we should not destroy those monuments because we need to remember the history. We don't want to forget the history. But I think the history can be taught without the monuments. I like, though, again, what Paul said earlier. We must vote. And voting means, he went through it very quickly, but you don't get on the jury rolls unless you vote. And so if you're complaining about having an all-white jury, you take yourself out of that process if you've not voted. We must vote. And there's no excuse for failing to do that. Earl was with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And if you think about what he stood for, what he fought for, you mentioned Selma, April, that resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Without that, I'll tell you, you don't get the mayors that you have in the South. Without that, you don't get the Congress people that we have in the South of color. Without that, I dare say you don't get Barack Obama. You may recall he did not win those Deep South states, but on Super Tuesday in the primary, he was able to hold his own because the grandmothers and the grandfathers of South Carolina and Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, they spoke up. They said, not today, not this time. And the question is, what do we say this November?
Well said, Benny. Well said. All right, I want to get your final thoughts. I don't know if that was your final thought, Ben, but you put a button in it. But Paul, what are your final thoughts?
Keep the pressure on. Don't give up. This is too valuable of a time right now. We have an opportunity to really, really make a difference in this country. Don't give up. Vote. Use our economic strength to make changes in this country. Pressure our legislators. Do not let this moment slip away.
All right. And Earl.
Well, one of the things, and the camera swings around the country now, and you get to see these people from all these places. I'm thinking of a woman who's the mayor of Atlanta. I see a young man, but there's so many people. They're so impressive. They're so ready. and they are in office because of the Voting Rights Act. If we can avoid being disenfranchised, we've got, I think that what is gathering in this country, it's on our side. I believe that we are on the verge of something.
Sister April, might I just say something very briefly?
Absolutely, Ben.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step.
Come on.
And so I would submit to you, now is the time to take that first step.
Yeah.
And many are. They're protesting for the first time. Many are. They're lobbying their legislatures to change state laws that we talked about that give an unfair advantage, if you will, to police. And the real question is, will they take that first step to vote in November? You have to be the change that you want to see.
Right.
And the future is now.
All right.
Very much.
All right. Well, thank you to Attorney Paul Martin, Ben Wilson, my brother, and Earl Caldwell for being with us. And remember that, this all starts with a conversation. It's imperative that you have it, even if it's in the midst of chaos. I'm April Woodard. Good night.